Hey, what's going on, Esoteric?
BadMouseProductions made another video. Oh man, I just can't take this guy seriously. This is the guy who supposedly became an ANCOM just to try and get into the pants of a Marxist YouTuber named Mexi. He became an ANCOM to try and impress a Marxist.
Gee, and how successful did he think he'd be, given the anti-male stances of most female Marxists?
Sorry, it's a boy.
Let's get into it.
Something's come to my attention whilst in exile. It's this: the map of economic freedom in the world. I've noticed it being used numerous times to bypass talks about capitalism's faults, simply blaming it on economic restrictions instead. You may remember V using it and the same argument in his response to me. If you see somebody using this map, I highly advise you link them to this video, as there are just so many problems with using this as a defense of capitalism's injustices.
And for all those watching, after you've done that, link them to this video so they know why he's full of shit.
So somebody says that capitalism creates really, really bad situations, death and all that.
How the heck does people voluntarily exchanging their time and resources in a free market create death? Whatever you're talking about, I guarantee that capitalism isn't to blame. In fact, if history is any indicator, it's far more likely that socialism, or the state, is.
Oh, screw that. I'm so certain that if you pressed him on it, he'd refer to something that the state did that I'd be willing to bet anyone $100. Go ask him about it. He'll probably tell you it was something along the lines of wars, or third world countries don't have developed markets so they can be easily exploited. Want to know how I'm so certain of this? Because in his video on capitalism's body count, that's exactly what he did.
But then somebody responds by saying, aha, and sending you the map. The map details countries in the world dependent upon economic freedom. In the green nations that are economically free, Hong Kong, Canada, Switzerland, New Zealand, there is plentiful wealth and relatively little systemic poverty or death. In the redder nations that are economically restricted, India, the Congo, Myanmar, or the Philippines, we see far more systemic poverty and death. Therefore, the conclusion goes that this is not the problem of capitalism, it is the problem of the lack of free markets. We must therefore get these redder nations more green, and our problems will be solved.
Well, that is what the strong correlation would suggest. Does it prove it beyond all reasonable doubt? Not by itself. I'd say that the correlation combined with numerous other lines of objective evidence do that. But let's hear what his counterargument is.
There's a lot of problems with this logic, and capitalism is not excused here. For starters, all that this map showcases is that countries with economic freedom tend to have less poverty. Not that economic freedom equals less devastation.
But the reason that these countries are prosperous is directly linked to the fact that they have economic freedom. For example, unemployment is lower in countries with more economic freedom. Why is that? Because regulations increase the cost of maintaining business and keep producers out of the market and reduce the efficiency of production, causing less jobs to be available for the general consumer. Upward income mobility is higher in societies with freer markets. Why? Because countries with freer markets have more economic opportunity for the reasons previously noted, and because competition creates innovation which improves living conditions greatly. Countries with freer markets are also demonstrably better than their controlled alternative in pretty much every aspect, and there's an explanation as to why this is.
Further, if you're going to assert that economic freedom is not the reason these countries are more prosperous, you're going to have to make a pretty convincing argument why. Each of the previously mentioned trends between less regulation and more prosperity are intuitive to the point that even someone with little to no training in economics can understand them. The simplest explanation is usually the right explanation.
This is only, after all, just one variable. Unfortunately for us, the world does not work on an on-off switch in regards to economic systems. Serbia and Uganda are literally 0.3 points away from one another in this study, yet one is considered moderately free whilst the other mostly unfree, which some may consider not capitalist.
Well, the third world is not capitalist, number one. And even if all countries would become socialist, they would still exploit the third world. They need resources.
Interesting that you cite that article, because I went and took a look at the article in question, and it cites the World Wildlife Fund, which, aside from the endless corruption scandals that it's involved in, making it a incredibly unreliable source, the standard for which it based the claim on, what the WWF refers to as the ecological footprint, which the higher a country is rated on this scale directly correlates with lower amounts of consumption. The two other points it cites are alphabetization, which has nothing to do with the environment and only shows us further that these environmental groups are nothing more than big government shills, because they're literally connecting centrally planned government with environmentalism. As for its last claim, that Cuba has a higher life expectancy, this has been debunked numerous times. More specifically, the only data for this claim is put out by the Cuban government with no independent fact-checking. And Cuba has been caught lying about the status of their regime in the past. Essentially, this study isn't proving Cuba is sustainable, in fact quite the opposite, that Cuba is a starving country with a lying totalitarian regime. But we didn't even need to know that this is total bullshit. Market economies are better for the environment demonstrably, and the reason for this is because private owners have a direct profit incentive to maintain the environment, because if the environment's destroyed, they can no longer produce their commodities, which means they can no longer profit. And we've seen examples of when there wasn't a profit incentive, such as the Soviet Union state ownership of the Black Sea. They destroyed it. Now it's so toxic that no one can even go in the water. And guess what? The Soviet Union also initially lied about that. The reason the truth even came to light is because they fucked up the environment so badly that you can literally see that there's less water and the water is discolored from a satellite in outer space.
Their nominal GDP is ridiculously sparse, as it goes for many other countries close to one another. There's a very pernicious and problematic line of thought that permeates our culture. We'll call it linear thinking. When we see a good example of something and a bad equivalent, it's very easy for us to assume we'll simply need to apply the good to the bad, then everything will be dandy. It is and continues to be a very prevalent mindset for all of us, and it's far too myopic.
True, so far as it goes. However, that's not what's going on here. We can document the effects that economic regulations have on the economy. For example, it can be objectively shown that minimum wage laws actually hurt the demographics that they are supposedly there to help, and that increasing the number of benefits that businesses are legally required to provide forces small businesses to close, leading to more unemployment. We're not just saying, life in Venezuela sucks and life in the US is awesome, so the answer must be that the US has a freer economy. We can point to specific variables in each country and show how economic policies enforced by the state are hurting the economy. The Index of Economic Freedom map is merely the big picture.
Because the truth of the matter is that we forget that many of these countries don't even have the ability to become economically freer.
Why not? You're not even going to try and explain yourself? Because that's a claim you definitely need to substantiate.
I second that. Citation, please.
This is where it gets very messy. A cake is made up of 1 part meeples and 3 parts weebles. Meeples are very, very good for you, but weebles are highly toxic. This seems ridiculous. If we thought about this linearly, wouldn't the correct way to do this be to simply not use any weebles at all? No. The twist here is that meeples alone are completely inedible. And in order to even it out, you need to fill in 3/4 of the cake with the toxic but edible weebles. So in this scenario, whilst it might seem like the solution is very straightforward, the reality is both ingredients are necessary for achieving a desired result.
Interesting story, but you're gonna have to show exactly how this is analogous to what we're talking about. I think we're going to see that this is the fallacy of weak analogy.
That's a horrible analogy. Just because something is good for you doesn't mean that you can eat something toxic and be fine. That would be like if you tried to eat an apple and then tried to drink an entire bottle of Drano because the apple is healthy, so clearly consuming something toxic is just fine.
Our economy works in a similar way. Poorer nations are used to keep richer countries rich. The main difference here being, of course, that only a small amount of that cake is even tasty. That's the first world. Capitalism is called that for a reason. It's about making profits. There is no corporatism. There is only what follows from the rulebook capitalism has established.
Are you kidding me? You're honestly trying to say that there's no difference between an economy where persons are free to exchange their own time and resources voluntarily and at their discretion, which sometimes leads to businesses going under while others succeed, and a system where the government, by force, saves failing businesses and then creates regulations that force others to go bankrupt? Yeah, those things sound totally the same. No such thing as corporatism, my ass.
That's a very naive and nearsighted view of the economy. And granted, many free marketers don't explain the economic differences between corporatism and laissez-faire free markets very well because they just assume that everyone understands. There are many differences between corporatism and capitalism which have observable effects on the outcome of markets, such as economic regulations increasing the cost of production by increasing the time required to produce commodities so that producers have to pay more for production, unnecessarily raising the cost of commodities by requiring people to add more to their products, or, as noted, when the government subsidizes corporations, which takes away the incentive that they have to compete because no harm will come if they lose their customers, and it removes a significant deal of marginal utility from that specific producer because they're no longer earning their money, they're guaranteed their money. Also, can we abandon this absurd notion that somehow free markets create corporatism? Corporatism is purely a product of the government, and can only exist if a government exists. And a government needs a monopoly on violence to exist, which requires a monopoly on arbitration, and monopolies cannot exist naturally, and aren't created by the free market. Monopolies come into existence when there is only one supplier or producer of commodities in a specific industry, and the only way to keep competition out of a market is with force, because otherwise investors are actually incentivized to directly compete in a small industry because untapped markets are incredibly profitable.
You can't expect an economy built in this manner to just go against its key interests, and if exploiting the third world keeps them competitive in the market, then so be it.
And how exactly is the third world being exploited? What did those countries look like before Western industries started building factories and offering them jobs? Did you think about that?
It couldn't be that third world nations have untapped markets due to economic authoritarianism, and companies from the first world are simply taking advantage of an underdeveloped market created by a lack of economic freedom, could it? No, because that would be the entire reason why free marketers keep referencing the lack of economic freedom in third world nations when central planning advocates mention exploitation.
The way that they accomplish this? Debt. Debt is a primary tactic utilized by Western nations. The two horsemen of the capitalist apocalypse, the IMF and the World Bank, love to shove loans down the throats of LEDCs like thick dollops of ice cream.
The World Bank and the IMF are government-backed institutions. I'm in full agreement that the modern system of banking, based on debt-backed currency, is completely corrupt. However, it's something that would never happen in a free market. Only when governments hold guns to people's heads and say, you will accept our debt-backed fiat money, which is only printed by our private central banks, do they get away with this.
And they don't have much choice in the matter. Either accept the demands, or there will be consequences.
Yeah, the government will send men with guns to force you into submission. That's not capitalism.
This is exactly what happens when you fail to make the distinction between free markets and government intervention, and why it's so important to distinguish the two from one another.
And what are their demands? Ironically enough, free markets. Which may very well lead us to question the validity of this map. These institutions enlist in the privatization and liberalization of trades in these nations.
Just stop. Does this shit honestly ever work? Does repeating yourself over and over again and completely ignoring detractors who constantly keep explaining to you how and why your view is wrong ever actually convince anyone of your position's validity? I guess just repeat lies until they eventually become truth, because that's something that Joseph Goebbels said, and Nazis and socialists are totally two different things.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that real socialism has never been tried.
This might sound great. Governments of the world have been doing this for nearly 40 years, and we're always told that the state is a horrible and inefficient catastrophe full of bureaucracy. But when we see it in practice, the results are a massively retrenched public sector and total destruction of key services needed to help the citizens of these lands.
Wow, what an absolutely pathetic rebuttal. But I suppose that this is what you're left with when trying to argue against the empirically demonstrable and economically provable fact that government agencies are less efficient, cost more to operate, and produce commodities of a lower quality than those of the private sector. We don't even need empiricism to prove this. The government is an organization which can get more money by simply declaring that they need more money from the private sector, and then they send people with guns to take it. Absolutely no incentive to compete, serve the consumers of their commodities, and no marginal utility whatsoever. Arguing against the fact that government agencies are less efficient is the economic equivalent of arguing that Earth is flat to geological science.
All I'm gonna ask is for you to describe your last trip to the DMV, or a comparable service in another country. How did it compare to all the similar services in the private sector?
Did you fill out the 1170?
I think I did.
Did you fill out the 1170?
I filled this out.
That's the 1190. You're going to have to go stand in the blue line.
Look, I was
sir.
already in that line.
Sir, don't get snippy with me.
Well, I've been here all morning.
That is not my prerogative, sir.
I wait in one line. They send me to another
Well,
line.
you know
They
what?
send me
You
back
can
to the-
always call to make an
I try
appointment.
to call. I can't get through. The line's always busy. It's ridiculous.
Go wait in the appointment line then.
I don't want to wait.
Sir,
I've got a job. I don't have all day. I can't say this.
You're going to have to take that somewhere else.
Hard.
All right, you know what? I'm on break.
These places will never pay their loans back, and that's the idea. When you're in debt, you are in a sense owned by someone. And when that person asks you for a favor, you sure as hell better deliver.
Which is why a banking system based on debt-backed currency could never exist without the government to enforce it. Check out Mike Maloney's video, The Greatest Scam in the History of Mankind, if you'd like to learn more. Link in the description.
These structural adjustment programs, as they're called, have resulted in the destruction of national industry and a return to production and exportation of primary resources. For us, that's the beauty of the free market. It always goes to the ones with more guns.
And if they're using guns to extort, it's not a free market.
Funny, because you just described the primary function of the government to a T.
And this is, if you're interested, one of the primary reasons for the immense continuation of disease and starvation in developing nations, making an economy sell off the public funds to private conglomerates and obey their commodity wishes, thus turning the game into profit. That means cutting to road infrastructure. People can't travel around as well. That means cutting to healthcare. People can't live healthy lives. This means cutting to education. Less people can expand their skills and grow as human beings.
Oh my god, you just unironically argued that there wouldn't be roads without a government. Anyway, no. All of those things you just mentioned can be voluntarily provided for in a free market, and have, and at a better quality for less. Why? Because there is a demand for those commodities!
Private schools, private hospitals, private roads. These things already exist. Arguing that the government is necessary for these things is demonstrably false.
It means the production for profits rather than people.
But that's the thing with private producers as opposed to government planners. Private producers cannot make profit in a free market without people buying their products. And if they're doing shitty things and in turn making lower quality products, no one will trade with them in turn not giving them any profit. The government not only doesn't have this feature because it makes money through extortion rather than trade, but also because the ability to just obtain profit by demanding more takes away the incentive for them to do anything for the people, which is exactly why disease and subpar living conditions are rampant in the third world. So you have it precisely backwards. The government operates by putting profits over people, and the free market operates under the function of you can't have profits unless people are satisfied.
So beautifully said, Esoteric.
This means that if you're not essential to the profit-making game, you're on your own, and you are externalized. Again, it's not designed to kill, it's a byproduct, by any means necessary. This might not be what you want, but it's what you got.
Gee, I'm not even sure I follow his argument here.
He's still making the same terrible argument, trying to claim that free markets create corporatism. Just the slippery slope fallacy, basically.
And so it's interesting that these two big boys are simultaneously telling us that poverty is decreasing and also doing their absolute best to keep these places as poor as possible. Some very vulgar libertarian types might argue that, well, if you make these third world countries richer, then you won't be able to buy their cheap goods. This kind of rhetoric is thankfully quite rare, but if someone is using it, I wish them a very, very pitiful existence.
And who is making this argument exactly?
So there's a fault of logic at bay here. It assumes that these nations are poor simply because they are economically restricted, not detained because they didn't get the historical head start and thus succumbed to exploitation and imperialism by the ones who did.
History does not have a final cause. There is no theological path that history must follow. Historical events are single, unique occurrences which alone say nothing about the future, nor is there any reason to suspect that they do. In fact, you know what? Historicism is one of the biggest argumentative absurdities that I keep running into, and no one ever says anything to criticize it. Historicism is stupid because a description of a whole society is impossible to accurately create because there's an infinite amount of variables occurring all the time which there is no way to account for because there's no way to observe them all. Humans are individual agents acting upon their own free will, and therefore human action can never be predicted with certainty, and because you can never accurately predict human action, you can never predict the future of an entire society. Natural laws, scientific or social, can allow us to be able to exclude the possibility of potential events in the future based on what we can observe from science or sociology. But for the opposite to occur would be an unfalsifiable hypothesis because no test or observations would be able to disprove it. And most importantly, it's logically impossible to know the future course of history when that course depends in part on the future growth of scientific knowledge, which is not possible to know prior to its discovery. But even upon its first glance, this is ridiculous. For instance, India today is a very poverty-stricken third world country. However, during the Maurya Empire in the late Iron Age, India was one of the most prosperous nations on earth because Arabia and Europe could only get spice from them at the time. Or how most of the Middle East is poor, yet the Phoenicians were prospering during the collapse of the Bronze Age. Or how Greece is currently in total economic collapse despite at one point in history having one of the biggest superpowers in the world. I could keep going. There is simply no validity to historicism whatsoever.
Are we going to say that countries like Switzerland or America are so great because of economic freedom or because of geographical placement?
Considering that both countries' economies are heavily stimulated by foreign trade and because Switzerland doesn't have any particularly valuable natural resources, I'd pick the former. I mean, yeah, Switzerland does have a lot of lumber, but they're nowhere near a significant producer of it.
Plus, if it's all about geographical placement, then how come Hong Kong, a nation with practically no natural resources of its own, has a thriving economy? And by the way, is first on the index of economic freedom?
Are we to say that countries like Afghanistan and half of Africa are in a hellhole right now because of economic restrictions? or because of interference from other nations?
Both.
Could it be that they are economically restricted because of interference from other nations? That's always a possibility as well.
Just because capitalism might work freely in some countries doesn't mean it's going to work well across the board.
Well, how about this then? Can you show me a historical example where a country became worse off after moving away from economic authoritarianism and towards free markets? I can think of plenty of examples where countries have become better off as they slowly moved towards freer markets, China being the obvious example. But I'd love to hear about a time where the opposite occurred.
Economic freedom is only possible through exploitation. Real, existing capitalism is not as simple as some petty commodities trade. And we got the head start. We were able to charge in first and place our bets. The same cannot be said for everywhere else.
And ironically, you ask, why Europe and not China? The question is misguided because China has indeed moved from communism towards capitalism, now having the second largest economy in the world. The answer is Europe and China, so long as they both continue to embrace capitalism. That's not to say that China is economically free. It isn't. But it is to say that as a country that was previously hardcore communist can see dramatic standard of living increases by moving closer to capitalism. Even the dreaded corporatism, as you see it, still tends to produce a way better standard of living than any full-blown socialist system ever has.
Yet we can illustrate one final sting to this map that showcases an extraordinary sense of unintentional bias.
Being biased doesn't have any bearing on the facts presented. Even if there were bias, arguing that the people making the list are biased is not an argument against their points. That would be like me trying to say that your video is inherently incorrect because your views are slanted in favor of Marxism.
It only showcases what may be true today. This map ignores economic history. No, by history I'm not talking about empires or slave trades, though they were without a shadow of a doubt instrumental to the progress of these nations. No, what I'm talking about is economic practices. You may not know it, but for most of the United States history, it's been protectionist, not laissez-faire free market. Most of the founding fathers and subsequent presidents supported to varying degrees a form of protectionism as their nation was developing from an agrarian economy.
Well, it's nice to hear a voice from the left admit it, because now you have to acknowledge the fact that the US never operated under a laissez-faire economy at any point in history, which debunks some of your historical lies. Though anyone with even a marginal understanding of economics could point out how it's impossible to have a laissez-faire economy in a state-controlled society, since the state inherently requires forced association to fund itself and further its existence. However, something you and all other Marxists don't realize is that, again, not all forms of markets are the same in function and conception. And one area that the American economy failed at early on was foreign trade. Foreign imports being incredibly expensive and scarce as a result of protectionist policies, with few countries wanting to trade with the US early on, which ultimately harmed the economy and the average American citizen. It also harmed production because it gave Americans less resources to work with, which in turn made manufacturing more expensive.
And we'd think that after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1934 was an absolute disaster, Americans would have learned their lesson about protectionism. I'd like to hear your argument that it was in fact the protectionist policies of early America that caused it to prosper.
In fact, in the 1880s, during its so-called Gilded Age, the country had an industrial tariff rate of 50%. 25% times its contemporary figure. It cared very little for international development and didn't really mind with the growth of monopolies.
Gee, it couldn't have been the lack of availability to resources or the price hike for competing brands on the market caused by these tariffs that made competition so scarce, could it?
Nah, no way. That would totally undermine his point about the necessity of government regulation.
And despite all this, America achieved the fastest growth rate until after the war. Why? Why use practices that we are told cannot work effectively?
That's because despite the tariffs causing all of the aforementioned problems, private businesses at the time still had significant marginal utility, which allowed them to allocate their resources more efficiently. Plus, the profit incentives still encouraged competitive practice on the international markets.
It could be appropriately said that the US prospered in spite of protectionism, not because of it. It's worth noting that virtually 100% of economists today agree that tariffs are horrible economic policy.
Because it interferes with the invisible hand. They use these policies because all economies require nurture.
Because the state requires them to exist in order to fund itself.
And of course, that makes it no mystery why they try so hard to dupe everyone into believing that they are necessary.
We don't just throw children into the wild and let them try and figure things out unguided and without help by using creative thinking. We train them. We train them into strong-willed model citizens, with enough information in their head to let them be prepared for all the challenges that come their way.
Which is done entirely in the private sector of the economy, since the state can produce nothing since it inherently doesn't have any resources, and has no incentive to do so, since all they need to obtain more money is to take more from the private sector, also giving themselves no marginal utility. But this statement also carries the gross assumption that economies are artificial constructs, when in fact they exist because of desire to exchange property and because some people desire commodities which they don't have. Economies have existed since people have existed, the earliest maritime trade routes, for example, being over 100,000 years old, 95,000 years older than the first government. But historical facts which refute this aside, in order to believe that economies are created by the state, you would have to believe that for 500,000 years, people never thought that they could give away property that they created to other people for property which they created and that they desired. I don't know about you, but I can barely perform basic tasks without thinking to myself, man, this would be so much easier if I just had something else.
Economies can't be nurtured by the state because the state is spending other people's money. You never spend someone else's money as efficiently as you spend your own. Best case scenario, the economy would function no differently than it would without state nurturing if the state were to spend the money exactly as efficiently as the citizens themselves would have.
So-called free markets of today take huge advantage from the state-funded schools, where they get a whole decade full of necessary learning to be used in the larger economy.
Public schools are more expensive, less efficient, and as I expose in my video on public schooling, does not exist to teach you necessary skills, but are based on the Prussian model of education, which is designed to teach blind obedience. But let's just take a moment here to acknowledge that BadMouse is not only advocating for state monopolization, but also is acknowledging that problems which are generally blamed on the free market are actually caused by the state. Make sure you keep a mental note of this, because I guarantee you he'll try and backtrack any time one of you calls him out for the inconsistencies of anti-laissez-faire ideology and claim that we have a free market society.
They take advantage of free access healthcare,
Mostly.
allowing that they be reassured and secure with worker livelihood. But
Universal healthcare is not free, nor do people take advantage of it in a market society. Similar to public schools, because there's no competition, single-payer service is more expensive and less efficient. In fact, Detroit private hospitals receive a large amount of patients from Ontario who choose the private alternative because in Canada they aren't even receiving treatment because of the single-payer system's rationing, since there are no market signals which indicate how much supply they need and what demand is for treatment. There's only a small window of time every morning to schedule a visit with the clinic, and if you miss it, you have to wait until the next day. Even worse, to preserve rations, single-payer systems won't even treat people in certain arbitrary conditions. In the UK, for instance, if you're at a certain BMI, they won't treat you under any circumstances. So if you're a fat kid who falls over and breaks your leg, tough luck, Tubby. You're gonna have to live in agony until you drop your bitch tits. But yeah, so compassionate is universal healthcare.
Why don't you check out the case of Alfie Evans in the UK if you'd like to see what single-payer healthcare can do? The state can literally decide whether or not you're worth saving.
the necessities to develop Western societies at this stage in civilization were drawn out through very illiberal, highly authoritarian and restrictive economic practice. We now live off the cream that has been churned out of the butter before it, of our historical legacy. And indeed, with early unindustrialized societies, markets are a lot harder to come by for the concoction of physical and logistical reasons. Fidel Castro once said in an interview that China could never have become the economic powerhouse it is today had it not been for the rapid and monumental centrally planned method in which it drew itself from.
And we all know that Castro was a total bastion of honesty and economic knowledge.
Actually, the exact opposite is true. Central planning killed nearly 1/8 of China's entire population, most of whom were forcibly starved to death. China's economy under full central planning was disastrous, producing no innovation, reducing working conditions to the point where sweatshop labor looked desirable in comparison, and destroying the environment as they had no incentive to maintain the resources. In fact, the reason China even has a corporatist mixed society today is because the legislators reached a breaking point where they needed a private sector to produce commodities for the state to further its existence.
And it's true. All of the privileges it takes today were brought about through enormous infrastructure gained through the rapid industrialization.
Industrialization that had been developed in Western countries under free market conditions that were then adopted and rapidly implemented by the central planners. However, as the USSR, China, and other centrally planned economies all discovered, innovations have to be borrowed from countries with free markets because there is no profit incentive to produce them under a centrally planned economy. You can't say that because central planners borrowed technology developed under free market conditions, we must have needed those central planners all along.
And even today, China's so-called libertarian capitalist miracle is hardly what the pundits state it is.
I have never heard anyone call China libertarian or free market, and if they did, I will stand by your side and mock them with you.
China still has far greater state enterprise and control than we give them credit for. Third world nations need this development in order to succeed, as indeed they were doing after decolonization, and their economies grew at a modest yet steady rate. Yet the market of today will not let them, because it requires it. It requires globalization to remain competitive. Yes, friends, even if that means destroying every so-called value and tradition it has.
Well, which one is it? Is trade protectionism and state intervention required to maintain a competitive market, or is neoliberal globalism required to maintain a competitive market? Even your own theory contradicts itself.
If you want to know why the West is somehow dying, you can blame the Chicago school, not the Frankfurt one.
The IMF is not a product of the Chicago school, as Milton Friedman is a well-known critic of the IMF. No, unfortunately the Frankfurt School is to blame for many of the problems in the West, as it's the ideals that they advocate for which has led to social divide and economic despair.
But then where exactly does this map come from anyway? Heritage. I know every group has an agenda, but Heritage is the last place I go for any objective opinion. They consistently write phony articles about climate change, the economy, and all sorts, and if you take a look at their list of trustees, well, yeah. This is the organization you're going to put your trust in for determining economic freedom in the world?
I evaluate Heritage the way I evaluate every other organization. Do they document their research and sources such that their assertions can be verified? And yes, they do. Far better than most left-wing organizations do. Just because Heritage has a right-wing bias doesn't mean the facts they present are wrong. If you're going to assert that the map of economic freedom is bogus, might you so show precisely where they screwed up? They make all the information easily available.
And interestingly enough, Heritage publishes this Index of Economic Freedom with every internet skeptic's favorite source. Oh. I guess not all heroes wear capes. I was going to explain how Heritage calculates the Economic Freedom Index, but we're running on here, and you can just look it up for yourself.
Correction. You skipped explaining that intentionally because if you did, you would have pretty much destroyed your entire argument. But then again, that's not hard, considering that your argument is fundamentally flawed on a factual basis and contradicts itself at multiple points.
Again, it's mostly their own opinions. Property rights equal economic freedom. Well, I'd argue that the institution of capitalist property rights has been the biggest barrier to human development for the past 100 years, but that's for another time.
Well, I don't hold your opinion in very high regard on the subject, considering that at best you have a very loose grasp on understanding free market economics, since you conflated the Chicago school with neoliberalism, claimed that the IMF is a product of free market enterprise, and insistently tried to claim that all observable information available, that increasing authoritarianism is a product of free market enterprise, even though you contradict yourself while making this argument, and that argument doesn't even make sense considering that states are, as noted earlier, a direct hindrance to the profit incentive and innovation.
At the end of the day, we can see from the SAPs and all of their clauses that Heritage's idea of what defines economically free are not what comes true in reality.
Then please explain what does. It's not enough to merely assert that their assessment is wrong, especially considering we can document how specific reductions of economic regulation lead to higher prosperity, as Esoteric already did earlier.
Well, that's not real economic freedom. Whether or not centrally planned utilitarian tyrannies are compatible with any sort of conception of freedom is another topic for another video. They're not. But the mere fact that you have to try and flip the proverbial chessboard and try and change the fucking rules instead of just staying on topic and arguing your point shows that even you significantly lack confidence in your case, which is a sign that you are aware of just how manipulative you are being.
And what are we even talking about here anyway? That this map showcases apparently that capitalism isn't the problem, but economically unfree capitalism.
Please refer to my earlier statements regarding the matter. I will not repeat myself.
We've showcased here that it doesn't disprove capitalism as the underlying cause, ignores the sanctions imposed by wealthier nations, ignores imperialist policy, ignores capitalism's inherent desire to perform such measures, ignores geographical placement, its very definitions of economic freedom are at fault, it uses reverse logic in determining why they are poor, and it ignores the historical policy for present-day abundance, namely restrictive, unfree markets.
You never really argued that restrictive, unfree markets caused the prosperity we see today. You just asserted it, citing Fidel Castro, of all people, as a source. How is it that when we can demonstrate that reducing regulations leads to lower business costs and therefore more disposable income, you can somehow claim that it was really the regulations themselves that led to present-day prosperity?
Points 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all faulty arguments, and the first 4 points contradict one another. If points 2 and 3 are correct, then point 1 and 4 can't, since points 2 and 3 are not products of free market enterprise.
Look, I understand people's want to find defenses for capitalism. After all, it's all that we've been taught. But to view the situation linearly and without critical thought, to the point of literally just linking a map from an organization who are in direct interest of defending the current system and its status quo, doesn't alleviate the systemic poverty as a result of capitalism's innate function to grow and grow as much as possible, and not care about the externalities. Poverty is the rule, not the exception. As time goes on, capitalism continues its journey of infinite growth, and we are approaching imminent collapse, and it's not slowing down. Anybody who wishes to contest this consensus, or simply deny it and return to antebellum, can pick a number.
Esoteric and I already made a video about so-called late-stage capitalism, and the impending doom that Marxists always tell us is right around the corner. I can sum up this video thus. BadMouseProductions concedes that those countries that are economically freer have a higher standard of living, asserts that this in and of itself does not prove that capitalism is the cause, and then concludes that because the Heritage Foundation has a right-wing bias, capitalism is not the cause, and we're all awaiting the impending doom of capitalism's collapse. I'm just not following. How about you, Esoteric?
Marxists have been screeching about late-stage capitalism every time an innovation in the market was created since as far back as the invention of the tractor. And every time they've been proven incorrect because Marxists believe in the insanity of innovation using up more resources. But the fact of the matter is that there has never been an innovation in history which has led to an increase in the cost of production or consumption of resources required. That's because those things are antithetical to innovation and defeat the purpose entirely. Rather ironically, the market through innovation weeds out both of the problems with so-called infinite growth. It makes a product require less labor to operate and makes production less expensive. The truth is that scientific socialism is not scientific. If you look at the falling rate of profit as Marx theorized it, the description of what he says will happen is identical to what were to happen if the state were to get involved in the market and impose artificial restriction on supply and cost increases, also known as regulations. Increasing minimum wage to keep more people out of the job market and increase the cost of production, antitrust laws to artificially make businesses less efficient, just to name a few examples. And what are all of the things that the far left agitates for? Exactly. These are not scientific patterns, these are self-fulfilling prophecies Marxists create, which they will then use to claim that Marx's predictions were correct once they infiltrate the government and implement them. Now, I can assume that many people on the left are misled and just genuinely believe this garbage, but the intellectuals and the politicians on the ideological far left undoubtedly know full well what they're doing, which makes their underlying intentions all the more Machiavellian.
Well, that's it for this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, both to me and to Esoteric Entity. And that's our 2 cents. So take it for what it's worth. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. You can also hit the bell to ensure you're notified every time I upload a new video. This video was made possible by my patrons. If anyone else would like to donate and help ensure that I have the time and resources to keep putting out content, for just $1 a month on Patreon or Maker Support, you'll have your name listed in the end credits of every video and the link to one of your social media platforms listed in the description. You can also support the channel by purchasing my 2 cents merchandise on Teespring. You can also follow me on Twitter, Minds.com, BitChute, WordPress, Gab, and iTunes. Uploads are every Thursday and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.